Welcome, everyone. Welcome this fine evening to everyone involved. My name is Michael Bidwell. This is Real Faith Conversations. I am joined by a dear friend of mine who's willing to tell his story. My friend and frankly mentor, David Hurst. I lived with him from, was it 2015 to 2016, and he was very influential in my life. And
Uh,
he was, he's been gracious enough to share his testimony with us tonight. So, welcome, David.
Thanks, Michael. It's great to see you again.
So let's get down to brass tacks. Let's talk about your background first.
Okay. Um, Boy, too much to cover, but I'll just say that I was actually born in Western Tennessee. Didn't live there very long. Moved to Atlanta when I was very young. Come from a very large family. My parents had 14 children, um, and had one sister that died when I was very young at 4, so 13 surviving. I was the middle child. I was 6 older, 6 younger. There were 8 girls and 6 boys. My dad was combination of a hardworking guy who was actually drove a truck for an auto transit company, but more than that was also a minister. And so he pastored 4 churches and actually was part of a Pentecostal denomination. And so most of my life was that of being a preacher's kid, and it was difficult for me, to be honest. The Pentecostal group that he was part of was rather legalistic and somewhat harsh, and I didn't fit that, so really didn't join the program. It was interesting because from very young I knew I loved God, but I did not love the church side of that. And so, as opposed to my siblings who came to the Lord when they were like 7 or 8, I was kind of going the other direction. And not that I was doing things that were horrible, but I just wasn't part of the program. And my dad and I didn't get along at all, and literally ran away from home. And actually, just before my 16th birthday, I went to a youth camp. And the honest truth is, I went to the youth camp because I was a pretty good athlete, and that's where you could show off, and there were girls there. So, but anyway, but God had other plans, and I had a pretty unique connection with God. It was to a level of supernatural that happened that evening, and so I, found that I loved Him, and at the same time, I still wasn't totally on board with the church thing. So that was kind of a struggle. But in spite of that, I started going to a church, not my dad's church. And pretty soon the young pastor there had me kind of leading up the youth group and involved in some outreach programs. And that went pretty well until that pastor left, and the new one that came in had no understanding of who we were. And so pretty soon following that, I thought, well, I want to I want to do something that is following God's will. And so I ended up going to a Bible school for less than a year, and that was both a good experience and a challenging experience. I think that when you were living with us, you were going to a school where that some parts of it were good and some parts of it were frustrating, because you do see in any of those schools, you see the hypocrisy and the double lives and the issues. Without saying names, there were people who I went to college with that are now known internationally. And, one of those extremely well known nowadays, but back in those days, he was out hanging out at the bars till 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning, but his dad was well known, so they kind of let him get away with it, I guess. But anyway, it was just beyond what I could, that portion of it was difficult. And so I ended up leaving the college, and for a period of time, came back to Atlanta. I had a pretty good work situation, and so I came back to Atlanta and just kind of focused on going on the work. And they were pushing me through a management program, and so continued with that. Ended up a girl that I had met some years prior. Ended up marrying her, and that lasted for 2 years, and then it didn't. But there was one piece of that that happened prior to the divorce. In fact, prior to us getting married, that was of significance to the rest of the story. So back before I got married, a couple 3 years before, I was again at this place of trying to hear from God, trying to see where I was going next. But there was a lot of confusion. And in the middle of that, and I was leaving my parents' house, wasn't thinking in a particularly spiritual way at all. And drove a few blocks up the road and got to a stop sign. And I'm always careful when I say God spoke to me, because I think it's easy for us to interpret what are our desires. This came out of left field. It was not something that was even in my mind at all, but I heard a voice inside of me that was, "You will have a daughter and her name will be Destiny." And I thought, okay, now that's just weird. At that point in time, I had never heard of a girl's name, a child's name, Destiny. And the actual thought I had at that moment was, that sounds very hippie-ish. This would have been, by the way, around 1977, I think. So, but it didn't go away. But then as I married this girl, I had this connection with, someday we'll have children and there will be a daughter and her name will be Destiny. And I thought, okay, what does that mean? But I didn't really have a clarity on that. Anyway, 2 years later, we got divorced. I said, okay, that's done. And I began to really search for something other than just what had been traditional church. So I found myself every night, started a journal, and I would write every night, "Dear Truth." So not that I totally discounted God. It was just trying to mix that together. Where was God in the middle of total confusion, and church didn't make sense, and my dad and I didn't get along, and there were just pieces of my family that I now call that. I don't think I've coined the phrase, and it offends some people, but I'm not concerned about that. But my family was what I called emotionally retarded. And if you understand the truest definition of the word retarded, it means not fully developed.
Right.
That was where we were at, a family that didn't express themselves well at all, really. Nobody said, "I love you." I'm talking about my parents, nobody. So there was this, huge void. But anyway, divorced and really going through, okay, what is supposed to be happening here? And it was, I guess, dated a little bit. And then probably 2.5 years later, I was working a different job, and I had run across, in fact, I'd always played sports, and I was coaching a softball team, and a girl that I met was going to this church that was really kind of energetic and had kind of come from that Pentecostal background that we had come from, but had also kind of broken free from that. So she invited me to the church, and I said, sure, why not? So I went, and I was very cautious, but in that, I began to feel that God was calling me back to Him, but it was through an expression that had a whole lot more freedom than the legalism that I had grown up with. And I hadn't been doing that with that church long, and I had the youth director, I guess you would call him, come to me and said, "Boy, I'd really like for you to help me." Well, this was a church of 120. They had a teenage group of 10 kids. So I said, sure. So I started helping, and it wasn't more than a month or two later, that same youth director said, "Oh, by the way, I'm going to seminary, and I've talked to Pastor Jones, and you're taking over." It wasn't like I had exactly volunteered for this, but I said, fine, but I absolutely love these kids. And
So
pretty,
you were voluntold is what
yeah,
happened.
I guess that's the right thing. But I love the
Okay.
kids, and I was working full time, but very quickly that church exploded, and we went from 120 to 350, 400 in a relatively short period of time. And that youth group went from 10 to, I guess, a total, including middle school and high school, was about 70. And we just had just a vibrant youth, and it wasn't a paid position. So I was still working and we were doing fundraisers and making money, and we ended up, this group, uh, we went to 2 events in Orlando and 2 or 3 in Nashville and one in Detroit, and all of it was raising our own money. But more than that, what I was teaching the kids was to take their own path and not to discount what was biblical, but that they really needed to understand that it was their voice, not, that this had to be their connection with God, not one that is necessarily following the footsteps of their parents because they were supposed to. One of the things I did, Michael, was I would always teach the senior high group, and one of the things I would always do is we're always in a circle. All the chairs were in a circle, and I was just one of the people in the circle. And I would start it off. It was always a conversation, and I would start it off with whatever it was that was addressing our life at that point in time, or their life, and then I would bring a biblical reference into that, but continue it as a conversation. And I was one of those that I would not allow those that would have been like you, who would try to sit in the back and not say anything. And if I found that person like Michael, then I would pick on Michael and
Nothing's changed.
ask him what he thought. But I really began to teach some things that, such as really connecting with what I call the hurting and the left out. And that became a major focus. And among those things, which those kids, my theme was be real. And among that, I was teaching these kids things like, and they still, even to this day, will quote some of these things back to me, but they would say, I would say to them, you need to understand there's nobody on the face of this earth that's more important than you are. And I mean nobody. And I'd say, but you understand what I just said means nothing if you don't understand the second part, which is there's nobody on the face of the earth that you're more important than. And I said, if you get both sides of that, then it allows you to look eyeball to eyeball with presidents and kings, but also to go sit with the homeless. And I said, and that's what we want to do. We want to recognize that God made you unique, and you have every ability to stand up in front of anybody with total confidence. But if you don't have the humility to go sit with the hurting, I don't want to hear what you have to say, because it's all about that, about both sides of that. And I got to see some things happen in those days among those kids, where the ones that were the popular kids were the ones that went and sat beside the ones that were not and embraced them. And so there was some connection there that was really unique. And I didn't even know exactly what we were doing. I had no idea how to be a youth pastor, but because no training, and just stepped into it, no college with it at all or anything. But to this day, I have kids tell me that I say kids, understand these are kids that are now in their 40s and beyond, but they tell me they never forget things they learned then.
Right. Let's go back a little bit to your childhood, because you were talking about seeing the hurt, seeing the loss. Did the experiences with your father and the struggles that he had kind of lead you to that direction, or was it something else?
Yeah, I think that was a fair amount of it. I think that I didn't know then, but I was an extremely sensitive kid. And so the very harshness that was part of a legalistic background just didn't fit me. And in some ways, I can't totally blame him. I mean, he also grew up, when I think about my grandparents on his side, the best way I can describe them very succinctly is both of them lived until I was probably 12, 13, 14, somewhere in there. My grandmother died first, my granddad second, I think. But anyway, in that entire time, not one time do I remember either one of them even acknowledging I was alive. So the total lack of even appreciating, of course there was a bunch of children, I mean, even though I had a sister that died, and by that time my oldest sister had gotten married and moved off, but there was like 12 of us. So you show up, and even if a couple of them were working, there's 10 of us that would show up when we would drive to Western Tennessee. And the only thing I remember at all, I guess that comes from the old concept of children are to be seen, not heard. And so, you sat around and you listen to them tell stories. But the truth is it makes you feel discounted. It makes you feel like you're not valuable. And so that was part of it. Somewhat different with my mother's side. Now, my mother's dad had died when I was very young, so I had no memory of him. But my mother's mother lived to be about 93, 94 years old. And she was a interesting, very sweet, but somewhat country lady, and heady sweat. She would chew not tobacco but snuff, and she was a good Baptist, but she would spit in her little spittoon, and every once in a while she would say something that the words weren't exactly what we would call proper English. She was quite convinced there were certain people that needed their rear ends kicked, except she didn't say it that way. So there was a distinctive difference, but in any event, growing up in a large family like that, you would think that it would be very warm and there was times. I mean, there's no question that there was times that it was fun. Guys, the brothers playing ball together and all that kind of stuff. And to this day, I have sisters. My mother was incredibly sweet. I've got sisters that were very much like her. But one of the things I've learned, Michael, did you know there's a difference between what I call nice and warm? There are people who are nice, and then there are people who are warm. And I found that the people that I knew that were warm, as far as expressive, were people that were outside of my family. So that's kind of the childhood thing.
Me too. At times.
Yeah.
But what did you learn? Like, did you learn anything positive from your father?
It was difficult in the moment because I think it's so important for all of us to have a father that actually sits with us, that you really get that sense that they are proud of you, that they're happy that you're sitting there, that you sit next to them and they don't have to say anything, but you can just tell they're. And I didn't have that, but I've watched really good dads who make their children feel important, make them feel valuable. And so as far as a direct connection where my dad said, well, such as he grew up in Western Tennessee and was a country boy, and I'm talking about the hunting and fishing, and his dad was a farmer. I didn't learn any of that. I mean, I never went fishing. Well, I went fishing with him once, but that was with the pastor of the church, and we went deep sea fishing. And so that's my only memory of doing something like that. But as far as him sitting down and teaching me anything that was basics, I just didn't get. I mean, how do you take care of a car? No idea. Just learned it on my own. I mean, I remember silly stuff like what's the structure of a house? And I thought, I mean, I didn't know, 2x4s and drywall and these are just some basic things you would think that you would understand somewhere along the way, but wasn't his communication style. But on the other hand, giving him a little bit of leeway there, he had, 14, 13, 12 children, and he was working his butt off to just put a roof over us and put food in us. And so, I guess you say that in a way he was doing the best that he could. And he also didn't have that. He didn't have a real good father gene, a dad gene. And so, but it really was a real disconnect between he and I. And so the bottom line is I ended up actually I ran away from home when I was 13. I ended up leaving when I was 17. And so, and I was working full time when I was 17, and I was gone, and it was understanding in the family. And this wasn't like this was a negative. It was just understood that if you want to make money, you go make money. I mean, I would hear these kids talk about getting an allowance, and to me, that was kind of humorous. An allowance? What's an allowance? You want money? You go work. You go find work. And so I did all of that. I cut grass and did errands and helped with paper routes. In fact, back then, this shows you how long ago it was, but we had a local dairy that delivered milk, and my older brother started working for them, and I became his assistant. That meant waking up at 3 o'clock in the morning and going down and loading the place and going out and delivering milk. And shoot, I was 12 years old, and it was, hey, let's go to work. I get paid for this. And even when he quit, the guy found out that I was available, and I had to get up at 2 o'clock in the morning and go to work with him, and he worked longer. So we delivered milk till 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And it was just, it was a whole lot of hard work. But to me, that's what you do. Wake up, go to work, make some money. And so that wasn't all bad. You know what? Necessity is a good thing. And so you learn how to work hard. So when I got my first real job, I poured myself into it. And this was a part-time position at a top-notch security company. I was working in the monitoring center, which was actually a very intriguing place. If you've ever seen movies that show the communication center inside of a submarine, that's probably the thing. If you can imagine that it's relatively dark and there's all of these different sounds happening, and every one of them means something. And so here I was at 16 years old working inside there, and I was by far the youngest person there. And I caught on quickly. And to the degree, I didn't even know how quickly I was catching on, frankly. And a year later, the vice president of operations brought me in and said, he said, "David, you're really good." I said, "Thank you." And he said, "By the way, we need somebody to supervise the midnight shift. Can you do it?" And I looked at him and I thought, I'm just now about to be a senior in high school. And he said, "Listen, I know the youngest person on that shift is 24 years old. So you got a 24-year-old, a 28-year-old, a 35-year-old, a 40-year-old, and a 50-something-year-old. And you're going to be their boss." And I thought, okay, well, I was already thinking, well, maybe. He said, "By the way," he said, "we're going to increase your pay substantially." Well, that was enough.
This was at 16?
This was at 17, just turned 17. So as a senior in high school, I would go to work at midnight, get off at 8 in the morning, drive 25 miles, 20 plus miles, and go to high school. Thankfully, I was getting off at noon. I was getting out so I was only there for 3 or 4 classes. And then I would try to stay awake a little bit longer and then go to sleep about 2 in the afternoon and get whatever, 4, 5, 6 hours, get up and eat and go to work. And I did that every day all through senior in high school. So, but at the same time, it put me in a position where that I was in management, and I had to learn very quickly. 17 years old, I had to learn. And by the way, we were protecting millions of dollars worth of stuff, and I was the one that was responsible of making sure it happened. So it was a great experience. And the truth of the matter is, I learned how to. I mean, I was talking to on a regular basis. I was talking to upper echelon management of top companies in Atlanta, and had no idea that I was 17.
So this
to not let them know that I was 17.
So this wasn't exactly legal.
Well, I learned years later that when they hired me, the gentleman that hired me actually filled out the application. So he wanted me to go to work for him. And so he filled the application out. I found out that the parent company for this company, Wells Fargo Alarm Services, they got bought out. But anyway, and the parent company was Baker Industries, and they did not hire anybody in that position for that group unless you were 18. So 18 was the bottom. So the reason why that gentleman filled out the application is because he wrote it down, and I didn't know it, but I was 18 that day, I guess. Because according to them, I was. And I guess this is kind of lying so you can get in the Navy or something, except I didn't lie because I had no idea. The gentleman did, and he had faith in me. And so I jumped in and went to work and had no idea that a year later I'd be supervising. And so to this day, I mean, here now I'm in my 60s, and just 3 or 4 years ago, I got a message on Facebook from a gentleman who now lives 500 miles away. And the message came in and said, "Hey, is this my 16-year-old boss?" I wrote him back and I said, "Frank, I was 17. But anyway, I mean, that was kind of the running joke. But, if you work hard and you treat people well, they'll treat you with respect. And so I became known and as pretty good at what I did, doing that kind of work.
Yep. So to go back to, I hate to go back to your background, but I thought of something.
Okay.
What You talked about your previous church, how it wasn't very good, even though you didn't go into depth. But is there anything positive that you learned from that, from your
Uh,
childhood, from that
yeah,
church?
yeah. I would say that among the most positive things was the influence that my mother had on me, because mother was probably, again, one of the most loving people, although, again, not one of the most warmly expressive people. But mother, you absolutely knew she loved you. Unfortunately, one of the ways that she would show us that she loved us was to feed us. So struggling with weight issues was a problem forever and continues to this day. I'll just say that being relatively poor, we grew up eating biscuits and gravy about every morning. And looking back on it, I understand why, because flour's cheap. And so, that's what you make biscuits and gravy with. And she would buy a little bit of what we call stricoline back then, which is ham that you cook the fat out of. And then you put the flour in it and turn it into a gravy, and it's biscuits and gravy, and you eat a little bit of egg with that, and that's your breakfast. And so, but the bottom line is she was actually a person that everybody loved. So this big family, you would think, wow, so many children, but that wasn't even close to the whole truth. My mother would always adopt, not literally, but we had not strangers, but totally new people that were coming in and staying at our house all the time. And so it was a normal thing that whoever was there among the kids, there might be one or two more that were also staying. And most of the time, those were the ones that were part of what I call the hurting and the left outs. They were somebody else's kids that had been thrown out. And mother would say, absolutely, come on in here. She says, now you'll have to sleep on something on the floor, or we got an extra couch over there, sleep over there. But she would embrace everybody. And, if you had shown up at 10 o'clock at night at my mother's house, probably one of the first things she would say to you is, are you hungry? And if you were, she'd get up and go cook. And she'll do that with everybody. So to this day, there are literally hundreds of people. Now, my dad, in that time process, besides becoming a pastor, he actually became the general chairman of the Georgia district for his association, his organization. And there were probably 50 churches, I don't even know the number, in the state of Georgia. And so he became the guy that ran that, and which meant that there were all sorts of ministers and wives that were coming through our house all the time. And so you just kind of got used to that. That was the culture, was, preachers and hearing them sit around. And unfortunately, what they talked about was what I would call somewhat dogmatic theology. And so, I didn't reject any of that, but I analyzed it. And so when I went into my time of doubt and questioning from the time I was probably 19 until 23 or 4, the that was part of what I would go through is, does that make sense? And I learned things. I learned not to totally reject those older people, even though if in their simplicity they didn't fully understand. But on the other hand, they presented to me areas of sincere dedication. And there was something to be learned from that. And so the things I do remember that were very positive, they did something. I don't know if you've ever experienced this, Michael. Have you ever been to a church where they had what the old folks call testimony service?
Actually, yes, on a mission,
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
down the road where we're about 20 minutes from my house. There's a church. It's called something different now, but it was the Mission Assemblies of God on the
Right.
reservation, and they would do that occasionally. Um,
And the thing is I frankly believe we've missed the boat by letting that go. Now the truth is sometimes people, when you allow that in the church, sometimes people are just dying to be seen and heard. So they stand up and say stupid stuff just because they want to be seen. But on the other hand, and I'm going to give you just two quick examples, but I'll never forget this one gentleman at a church that we went to when I was probably 8 or 9, and he was an executive for a top company in Atlanta. So he always wore a suit and always looked somewhat dignified. And when he would stand to give his testimony for that service, he'd stand, and as soon as he stood, he'd start weeping. And he was so overwhelmed with the incredibleness of God. and how much God meant to him. And this very dignified man would sit there and try to wipe back tears and would talk about how much he loved God. And that impacted me more than anything any preacher said from the pulpit. On the other hand, there was also a lady, and we knew this lady, and to say that she was broke was an understatement. I mean, my mother would make her clothes, because my mother was a seamstress. We would go by and pick her up and bring her to church. And here's the truth. So she was broke, barely surviving. We'd take her, and she'd stand up during that testimony service, and I'll never forget it. She'd stand up, and as soon as she stood up, she would start laughing. And she would sit there and joyfully tell you about how blessed her life was and how much she loved God. And I thought, and that impacted me, again, more than anything I ever heard from that pulpit, because the depth of absolute sincerity that came from them was so much more than the attempt to religiously or theologically capture me to fit within a certain mindset. It was the simplicity of their love for God. So it taught me, and many years later, during my own time of doubt, and even since at times when I've had difficulty with traditional church, the Western American church, that at times to this day I'm not in love with. And one of the things I really captured was where Paul said, I have determined among you to just know Jesus Christ and him crucified. And so I simplified it down to that. Now I can talk theology with you to a pretty deep level.
Oh, I know.
And I won't. Because the simplicity of it is, it reminds me of a story that I heard about a young man that was at a service, and you and I have been around enough of a spiritual move that we understand this. But this young man who was, 7 or 8 years old, literally passed out under a spiritual connection. And I'm talking about was gone. Now, it's hard to explain how that happens, but I've seen it. I mean, there's a place they've gone to that is just spiritually deep. And anyway, and so when he came back, he said, I literally got to visit heaven. Well, they're going to look at him like, okay, you're 8 years old. Right, whatever. He said, no, really, I did. He said, I got to sit with Jesus. And they're going, okay, sure, right. Okay, well, if you did that, there must be something really profound that he said to you, right? He said, yes. They said, well, what did he say? And he said he loves us. And that's all. And I thought, y'all, he just said the most profound thing you can get is when we understand that the awesomeness of God himself absolutely adores the very being, the essence of your being. And that's the truth. And he wants to be your father, your friend. And so that's why I step away from a lot of the theology and say, this is what I believe is the gospel. Jesus loves me, this I know. Jesus loves me, this I know, for the Bible tells me so. And so I keep it in that simple of a vein until people start trying to push their theology on me. And then I say, you don't want to go there. Yeah, because I'm a nice person and I don't argue. So
about certain things.
I'll say that.
So let's go into your back to your you being a youth pastor. What would you say to youth pastors of today?
I have seen several of them, and I don't want to be critical, but I do want to be critiquing. And I have been very disappointed with a lot of them because, and the ones that I've been most disappointed with are the ones who actually got a degree in college and came back and became youth pastors, because I find them to be overly intellectual. They want to prove to the world that they're intellectual. Not only that, but their goal in life is to have the young people accept them as being one of them. And so I have seen these youth pastors that spend more of their time talking about who are the popular music artists today, and do very little about challenging young people about what their purpose is. And when I was a youth pastor, I actually was reading a magazine, a youth magazine, youth leaders magazine, trying to see how do you do this. And there was one thing that I'll never forget. It really did capture me. One writer said, the one thing that we're missing is an understanding that these kids do not want to be entertained. What they want is something to die for. And I think that's what's missing. The challenge of the truth of the gospel is that we have something that is profoundly real. And the whole world is hurting, and they're looking for something that's real. And most youth pastors are trying to be relevant, or I would even go so far as to say in bowing at the altar of relevance. So therefore, they're fully accepting of things that come from the culture that are just wrong. And
Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
yeah, absolutely. I mean, I guess I can cross over into one other area, but you and I went to a church that where I saw in front of me where that there were people who were part of the worship group that were actively in the gay community, and when I say hurting and left out, I fully believe that we love everybody, and that includes those that I will say as honestly as I know how to say, who have found themselves at a place of confusion where that they believe that it is a natural thing to have attraction for same sex. So there's no such thing as a gay gene. And so to say that that is a natural thing is simply a lie. But at the same, having said that, to not love that individual is wrong. But in the church setting, you also don't put them in a leadership position. And that was what we saw. And so I think that that's what has happened with so many churches is they are so desperate to try to seem as though they are relevant to the culture. And I don't think we're supposed to try to be relevant to the culture. I think we're supposed to be the guiding light to the culture. You know, this little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine. And that's, again, simplicity. But I'm not supposed to be going out there looking for a way that I can get them to accept me or embrace me based on some level of relevance. Now, if there's a light that's coming out of me, then I want them to follow that light. But that light's not me, even though I hopefully reflect that light, or as you have heard preached before, however that works, I want to become a moon because the moon has no ability to shine light, but it has a great ability to reflect light. So anyway, so that's what I have seen that in the youth culture and among youth leaders is so many of them, and quite honestly, are wimps, and they don't have the courage to step up and say this, not in a legalistic way. God knows I don't want to see that, but in a painfully honest, courageous way. Yes, there are answers to what the struggles of the culture, and that is whatever it is. I mean, to this day, one of the biggest killers of youth and teenagers is suicide. So a major issue is depression. And
So,
go ahead.
it's funny you mentioned that because as you were talking, I was just thinking identity, 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 identity.
So much.
And so, what would you say to today's youth?
You know, I think that the critical part is you're reminding me of back when you and I were going to Bethel, and during that time, you probably remember, but I had this. I've always had young people. I mean, God has put young people in my life, and so there was, one in particular who I was close to. That was a young lady that her mother and I had become friends. And so there were times when I would actually bring her to school. She was going to a Christian school, and she played the cello. So I would bring the cello up there. And one of those times I was bringing the cello in because she had practiced that afternoon. I owned my own business, and so I had time, and so I could do that sort of thing. So I'd be working in my office, and it was like, oh, he's going to need that cello. Let me run that in there. So I did that. Well, the gentleman who was the head of the school and was over both the high school and the middle school happened to be coming up the walkway as I was bringing that in, and we started talking about the cello and what a beautiful instrument. And then he kind of asked me about my background. And I told him I had been a youth pastor. And so he looked at me and he said, so as a youth pastor, he said, if you were dealing with youth today, what would you do to try to really impact them? He said, I have some real struggles, both at the high school level and the middle school level. And I said, quite honestly, I said, I believe that fasting is something that is a good discipline for people of faith. I said, but today, while I'm not against fasting food, the thing that I would challenge young people to do is to take one 24-hour period every week and fast. Yeah. And he said, you can't do that. And I said, says who? I think if you challenge those kids, he said, how can they do it? They use it, for study and everything. I said, sir, I think I know exactly the time frame. He said, when? And I said, from 4 o'clock in the afternoon on Saturday until 4 o'clock in the afternoon on Sunday, because Saturday night should be a family or hang out with your friends. How many times have you seen teenagers nowadays? They're all together, but they're not even talking to each other. They're all glued to that phone. That hand has come out of that phone and grabbed them by the face, and they're not even communicating. So have them put that phone up and go out and have a social relationship that doesn't include anything that's media. And if possible, if they have to have the phone, say, okay, you can only use it, and a weird concept, just a phone. But you can't pick it up for any other reason. So that would be difficult. But then they wake up Sunday morning, and especially if they're in the Christian community, they're going to go to church. So don't touch that phone. For that matter, leave it at home, or make sure, but it's not something that you attach to at all. And then following church, go home, have dinner, or go out and have dinner with your family, again, with friends. Focus on that connection that we so sorely miss. One of the things as a youth pastor that I taught this all the time, and Michael, you've heard this so many times, and that was the verse that says, you will be known for your love to one another. You'll be known by those out there that are looking for a light. They're looking for hope. They're looking for an answer. And they will see it because you and your friend love each other. And that's something they don't see. And the love is real and it's unique. And so I think that that's what the young people have to develop. Well, how do you do that when you're just like everybody else and you have that phone in your face all the time? So I mentioned this to him, and it was interesting. So this gentleman, very intelligent guy, and he looked at me and he went, David, that is profound. He said, I'm serious. He said, I don't know if I can pull it off, but I'm going to try to see if I can do that.
It's simple, but it can be profound.
Yes. Yeah. You think about that. At least for one 24-hour period, I'm going to live without that phone. And in the process, you find out, yeah, I can live without it. One of the things I have found out, and this is not so much spiritual as people who have levels of intelligence and wisdom, but I have heard that there's a huge number of men and couples who are worth a fair amount of money who absolutely will not allow their children to have phones until they're up into that 15 or 16-year-old range. Nowadays, we're giving kids phones.
Yeah, I didn't get my first phone until high school. So
yeah. And so, so the belief is they're 11 years old. They need a phone so I can keep up with them. And I'm thinking, I understand that there are security reasons. It makes sense. But boy, you're introducing this whole world of danger to them at the same time.
Try to get a Razor or if you can, get a phone that doesn't have internet.
Yeah. And that's, go back and if it's possible, get a flip phone.
Yeah.
So it is not interactive. You're right.
Right. So, you talked a little bit about, divorce and marriage and I'd like you to talk a little bit more about that, but also what advice do you have for people like me in their 20s and 30s that are looking for that better half, that second half, the person that we become one flesh with?
Michael, you and I have sat and
Wait a minute.
talked.
we've talked about this a lot personally, but
Now,
for the record,
and I want to say, but here's the truth, and you know some of these people, but through circumstances, while I have not been even in active youth ministry, I have done a fair amount of counseling. And one of the things, because that is an issue that comes up, so you have young people and they're wondering, okay, how does that path work? How do I not, I mean, maybe there are those, that there's dating possibilities. And some, they feel like, well, I'm not even dating much. So, how's this going to work? And during my time of, well, actually now being divorced twice, by the way, to the same person. But the one thing that I learned, especially the second time, that the most important thing that you can do is don't go looking for romance. That is such a mistake. And so what I have said over and over again is one of the most wonderful things in the world is to develop true friendships. And and yes, I strongly believe that friendships with the opposite sex are actually very healthy. And you have to have honest conversation and honest boundaries, because those can go the wrong direction. And especially not just young people, everybody has hormones. And so, there are circumstances where something can go the wrong direction. And especially in this culture where they absolutely don't see anything that is noble or holy about the sexual act. So I think it's so important that young people, that people that are following Jesus Christ, fully commit themselves to becoming friends. And that means better friends with those that are their own sex, but also good friends with those that are not. And in doing that, you begin to find out if you are a person who sees deeper, you begin to see even among your friends the things that you would like to have, but also the things you won't live with. So you see the personality of people, and it's like, I really like her, but I don't think I could live with that.
yeah,
And that's the thing, to figure that out. When I was a youth pastor, by the way, and I can't claim this, I stole this from somebody, but especially among the young girls, I sat down with them as a whole, and then at times I would sit down with them individually. And I remember them saying, I'd say to them, I'd say, okay, here's what I want you to do. I want you to sit down with a piece of paper, and I want you to have, or maybe two pieces of paper, and one of them is the things that you absolutely will not live with. So whoever it is that you marry, the things that you won't put up with. And I have had so many young girls say, I don't know what that is. And I would look at them and say, so it's okay if he beats you? They'd say, well, no. And I'd say, oh, we got number one, don't we? And I'd say, it's okay if he does drugs? No. I think we got number two. And I'd say, so but he can drink to excess? No. Well, I think we're getting somewhere here. And I'd say, it's okay if he fools around? No. I said, I think we're adding up some things here that I said, now it's time for you to start adding something. Well, I said, what if he's just a moody person? Well, that might be something you've got to live with. And that's a personality thing and he can work on it. But, so there are character flaws that you simply I'm not going to live with. And then there are personality flaws that you might have to live with. Yeah, you work through, you know. He's not a great communicator. Okay. Might be able to work with that. He's not somebody that his family hugs a lot. He can be taught that that's something that's important, not just going through the motions. But anyway, so that's the things you won't live with. Then you turn around on the other side and say, what are the things that I absolutely want? And what's the number one of those things? And it was interesting to me because they'd say, well, I'd like for him to be cute. And I'd look at him and say, you're serious? That's number one? And I'll never forget, I had a young guy that came to me when I was a youth pastor, and he was telling me how much he was in love with this girl. And I said, so describe to me, why do you say that? And he went into this, and I said, see, I don't believe it, because what you're telling me is that she's cute, she's really pretty, and that she's really funny. And I said, so let me ask you something. If God forbid, but she's in a car accident today and her face is mangled up, and she even struggles being able to talk clearly, do you still love her? And I promise you, that young man looked at me and he kind of looked for a minute and he looked and he went, I think so. And I said, no, you don't. Tell the truth. No, you don't. And I said, you love the pretty face. You love the smile. I get that. Perfectly normal, but you don't love the person.
Right.
And I said, and until you get deeper to find out who she really is, and that works both ways. So back to the friendship. That's really what you're looking for. Who is this person? And the way to do that is get to where you hang out with them. You do spend time. You talk with them. You play games, wholesome games. Go do things that have really good interaction where you can get to know them. And then in that process, it might not be that person that you feel like, okay, that's the one, but you have learned a lot by becoming friends with that person that gives you an example of what it is that you're actually looking for. And then you also understand, by the way, you're never going to find perfection. And so there are certain things that everybody has that are weaknesses that you have to say, okay, God, I still really like him. I really like her, and you say, you know what? Some of those he's going to have to iron out. And if you feel like that this is the one, then it works. On the other hand, I'll go ahead and go down this path, even though it makes some people uncomfortable. But with the group of guys back when I was youth pastor, I was with them. And so we started having an honest conversation about sex. And so, how do you deal with this with guys or girls? And so one of the things I said, because I'd always told these kids I would be perfectly honest. And so I looked at those guys and said, okay, I'm not going to go totally into this, but I'm going to say one thing. Here's a fact. Y'all going to agree with me that the female body is beautiful? And they're going, yeah. And I said, okay, so now we agree with each other. Now, on the other hand, I want to ask y'all something. Do you want to get married someday? All you do, raise your hand. And they did. And I said, okay, how many of y'all want your wife to sleep with somebody else? Well, that's kind of a dumb question, right? And they would go, no. And I'd say, but if you sleep with a girl now, aren't you sleeping with somebody's wife in the future? And they would go, and I say, so see, here's the deal. You got to understand that God doesn't live in time. And that person the old term was betrothed, is meant to be with somebody. But then you're sleeping with somebody's wife, even though they're not married yet. And that's what I'm telling you is you got to bring this thing to a level of elevation of where that it's really important to do the right thing because you want to have the right relationship with the right person. And so, and of course that works on both sides of the coin. So I'm surprised I didn't get in trouble for speaking that straightforwardly with them, but
So I'd like to kind of switch on subjects because when we were talking a few days ago, you went into great depth about your daughter and how that affected you, her struggles affected you. Do you mind talking a little bit about that?
not at all. Yes, but no. What happened there? And I had mentioned that I had known that God had spoken to me and said that I would have a daughter and her name would be Destiny. And then, of course, I was married to this young lady and then divorced and felt like that Destiny person was connected to that person. And so then I was divorced for 3 years. And it happened that at that church where I became the youth pastor, at one point in time, that now my ex came into the same church. So she came back to the Lord that day, and she and I connected again. And so a few months later, we were married again. So second time. And so I guess from that point, it was probably a year or so later that she was pregnant. And during that entire time that she was pregnant, I called that child Destiny until the child was born, and we were thrilled to have Benjamin. So the oldest one was my son, Benjamin, who was just a joy and who I loved dearly. And then about 2 years later, she became pregnant again, and it was getting towards the end of the pregnancy. I think that there was like 3 weeks away, and I came home from work one day, and She had been cleaning everything. I knew nothing about this thing they call the nesting syndrome, but she had cleaned the car. She had cleaned everything. And I got home, and so I just came in and actually laid on the bed, and she had laid down too. And in that classic woman's way, she said, "What are we going to do if this is a boy?" We didn't have a name for a boy, and we didn't know. Back in those days, you didn't necessarily know. And I said, "Don't worry. This is destiny." She said, "Fine. If it's a boy, you're going to name him." She stood up from the bed, walked towards the bathroom, got to the bathroom door, and suddenly she screamed, and her water had broke. And we got moving, and she would have children quickly, by the way. And we got to the hospital, and in less than 2 hours, we had Destiny. And so that was just incredible. And by the way, another 2 years later, we had my youngest son, Caleb. But so things were going well. I had a new business I was working for. I was a regional manager for a company out of Texas and traveling a fair amount. And I just love Destiny, and you'd have to have seen her back then. She had this incredibly beautiful curly blonde hair, and she was just the definition of sweet and quirky and fun. And Benjamin absolutely adored her. And well, leading into her third birthday, then Caleb was a few months old. And probably 4 weeks before her third birthday, we noticed that she had swelling between her eyes. And so I told her mom to bring her to the pediatrician. And I went off on a trip. Called back, and he said, she's fallen. She hit something. It's just swollen. Said, should be better in a few days. 2 or 3 days later, I get home from the trip. And that was probably maybe only 2 weeks before her birthday when that happened. I get home from a trip, and I look, and I went, ooh, that looks bigger. And I did not even come close to understanding what I do now about medicine and those sorts of things. But anyway, and I said, you know what? We need to learn. We got to find out something. So we brought her back to the pediatrician, and he had this look of concern on his face. And he said, you know what? Let me call somebody. He did. And he called a guy that he knew that was at the Children's Hospital in Atlanta, Eggleston. And we brought her up on a Friday. And the quick version of that is that we brought her up. They did x-rays. They did scans. And then the next thing I know, they're doing scans, but they're doing a sonogram, and it's not of her skull where the swelling was, but it's of her abdomen. And my limited understanding of things, even then, I became profoundly aware. And I got physically ill. We're standing in the room with Destiny. And I thought, oh my God, if this is started here, but they're looking down here, this is cancer. And it has metastasized. And I was right. And so just a short time later, one of the beautiful things in that extremely dark day happened. And, here she is. And by the way, during that last few days, she had gotten where she wasn't even playing much. And you could tell her energy level was down. And so, but anyway, 2 doctors walked in. One of them was the head of neurosurgery because they thought we're looking at something here. And the other one was one of their top oncologists. He was a little short Puerto Rican guy and walked in. And the first thing I noticed was he introduced himself as Dr. Roger Vega. And on the lapel of his smock, he had a pen. Now understand, this children's hospital was connected to Emory University, one of the most renowned schools in the world, and an incredible medical school. And to find a doctor with this pen was not just unlikely, but almost impossible. The pen said, Jesus is Lord over Atlanta. And I was so drawn to that. But he walks in and he says, well, let me tell you the truth. He says, you have the wrong disease. He said, but you have the right hospital. And he went on to tell us that they would not know until they did a first look surgery, but that they were pretty sure that it was neuroblastoma. Neuroblastoma starts on the adrenal gland, and Dr. Vega, who, by the way, back then and to this day is one of my dear friends, and he taught me later on that it is what they sometimes call the demon of pediatric cancer, because it's like if you beat it in one area, it comes back in another, and it almost comes back in a different form. And you're fighting. And I did not know at that point in time that Dr. Vega had never had a winner. He had never had a survivor of stage 4 neuroblastoma. So when they finally did the first look surgery, which was the following Monday, which, by the way, was her third birthday, and they did first look surgery, and they did open up her abdomen and looked in, and we sat down with the surgeon, and come to find out later on, we found out that both Dr. Vega and the surgeon had begged each other to come talk to us because neither one of them thought that she would survive 30 days. It was a late stage 4. Come to find out, she had tumors in both of her legs, in her knees, and inside of her abdomen, she had one tumor that was so large that it was displacing organs. It had already destroyed one of her kidneys, but then there were more small tumors than he could count, his exact words. And I could tell looking at him, he looked like he was telling us, she's going to die. He didn't say that, but that's exactly what he was saying. And so they sewed her up, took 3 days. She started recovering. Dr. Vega came into the hospital room and said, back then he called me Mr. Hurst, but he said, Mr. Hurst, he said, we want to do an experimental chemotherapy. And I was confused. I said, why experimental? He said, we're in trouble here. And I read between the lines, and he's saying, she's not going to make it long. And he said, if we start a regular protocol and it does not work, and he paused and he said, well, we're in trouble here. And I said, sure, we'll do that. The experimental is important to the story, and I'll tell you in a moment why. So they gave her the experimental chemotherapy, and 8 days later, we brought her to see the surgeon who had seen inside of her and had seen this grapefruit-sized tumor. And so by then, the incision is starting to heal, and so he's pressing her abdomen, and he keeps looking funny. And he says, what? And so we said, what? He said, I can't find it. I said, can't find what? He said, that tumor, the big one. He said it was big, and I can't find it. And was like, well, that's good, isn't it? He said, yeah, like really good. And so we knew something was happening. Well, in no time, this huge swelling, understand, the swelling was so large that it was closing her eye, and it was disappearing. She also had tumors in the bones of her cheeks, in the back of her skull. She had several. They were all over her body, and we're physically seeing this disappear. So we're saying, thank God, they found this incredible chemotherapy, and it's working. So it was at least 30 days before we started the regular protocol. So we started off doing this experimental chemotherapy, and then we started the regular protocol. Without going into all of that, we basically lived in the hospital a fair amount for a year. So we would go in, do chemotherapy, stay in for about a week, and then we would be out for 2 to 3 weeks where she's recovering from all of the chemotherapy, and then we would go back in and do it again. And this was over and over. As we got towards the latter portion of that, they had already determined that they wanted to do a bone marrow transplant, which, by the way, was the miracle in itself, because the bone marrow transplant was not covered by insurance, and the cost was going to be about $500,000. And that we still to this day don't know who, but the social director at this hospital came and said, don't worry about it. Somebody's got it covered. So I still don't know who paid $500,000, for my daughter to get to get what they call experimental, which is standard nowadays, but a bone marrow transplant. We were one of the very first bone marrow transplant, autologous, which means they took her marrow and then they sent it off to the University of Florida, where they cleaned it. And that's an incredible concept by itself, but they cleaned it. They take all of the malignant cells out of it and freeze it again and send it back, and then they put it back into her. Nowadays, bone marrow transplant probably generally takes 2 to 3 weeks. We were in the hospital in a very confined room for 7 weeks, and it was extremely difficult the first week. It was, it was questionable whether she was going to survive. It was extremely difficult. But 7 weeks later, they finally let us go, and she wasn't eating, and it was really difficult. We had to feed her through her nose for, a month or so, but she began to recover. So sometime following that, they had done all of the testing again, and she was in remission. So we're about a year past her third birthday, and somewhere around her fourth birthday, we did this out of no longer doing treatment, and she was in remission. What did they call it? No evidence of disease. But Dr. Vega and I had become friends by then, and we sat down at one point, and he told me, he said, let me tell you about the pathology report. He said it came back, and he said, I'm just going to tell you this. Back then, they called it an oncogene count. And he said, if I remember correctly, an oncogene count that is somewhere under 50. He said, hopefully low. He said, then it means the strength of the disease is not huge. And he looked at me and he said, David, hers is the worst I've ever seen. And I said, what does that mean? He said, her oncogene count was 166. So it was off the charts. Said, what does that mean? He said, it means the chances of her having a relapse are very, very good. Okay. So we bring her home, and it was 18 months later from her diagnosis that we were at a social event. It was near Christmas, and we were at a social event, and Dr. Vega was such an incredible man, and he was so full of joy and life, and everybody loved him. Every one of the kids loved him, every one of the siblings and the parents and all of this. Little side note, at one of those events I had been to, and nobody hardly knew his wife, Ketty, and she's such a sweet, incredible lady herself. She's also a PhD doctor and a researcher in pediatric oncology. But I saw her sitting in the back of the room, and she's by herself, and everybody's up there surrounding Dr. Roger Vega. So I went to the back of the room and talked to Ketty, and I said, Ketty, how does he do that? He's up there, and he's just loving all these kids. He has to know that he's going to lose some. And she looked at me and said the most incredible thing I've ever heard in that context. She said, David, he's not a doctor. And I went, excuse me? Oh, she said, he's got the piece of paper. She said, but he knows he's not a doctor. He's a minister. And I went, whoa. She said, I can tell you that there have been so many times when I woke up at 2:00 in the morning and he's praying for one of his kids that's not doing well. This doctor she said he does the best he can within his doctor ability, but he knows who's in control. And that just blew my mind. And I thought, how do I end up with, in my opinion, the best pediatric oncologist that's ever lived? Because he loved God and he loved these kids. And yes, he lost some, and he would go to the funerals and he would hurt with the parents. But anyway, that particular event, and there's all these people surrounding him. Finally, there's not as many people. People are going home, and so I walk up to him. He and I are friends at this point. I mean, I'd have dinner with him or go play golf with him. But I walked up to him and I said, Roger, you got to tell me something. He said, okay. I said, to my knowledge, there have been 5 neuroblastomas since Destiny. 2 of them had died. And I said, none of them got the experimental chemotherapy. And I'm just wondering why. He smiled and he said, I knew you would ask me that someday. I said, what's the deal? He said, here's the whole truth. He said, Destiny was one of 10 children in the United States that was given that experimental chemotherapy. He said, of those 10, 7 of them are not with us today. 7 had died. He said, of the 3 that have survived, she's the only one we saw a response from. In our medical opinion, that chemotherapy does not work. And I went, but 8 days from the time she got the experimental, we saw this thing retreat. I mean, disappear almost. And he went, David, I think you need to look above the clouds. And I went, I'm totally, and it struck me. I'm 18 months later, and I had no idea. We had seen a miracle, and we had no idea. the chemotherapy would not work just on her and not on somebody else. And that disease had, and the only other thing happening at that point in time was prayer. So we had seen a miracle. We just didn't know it for 18 months. And I was so blown away. Now, the very quick rest of that story. So we continue and do well. And by the way, the standard is that if you're in remission for 5 years, that you're considered cured. So we made it 5 years. And so she's 8 years old, and we are so thrilled. And we had a huge event at our church, and we called it a true celebration. And we had 200 people there that were celebrating with us. And we had 3 or 4 speakers, and our number one speaker was Dr. Roger Vega. And he was just awesome. And then 2 months later, she relapsed. At that point in time, after we did testing on a Friday, and the next morning, Roger Vega called me at home. And I will tell you this, that man loved my daughter, and probably still does, almost as much as I do. And he was so emotionally broken, he couldn't hardly talk. And he just said, David, it's back. So we knew that it was back. And I said, okay, Roger, so what do we do? And he said, we hit it with heavy duty chemotherapy, but I do need to tell you, he said, I've done the studies and I cannot find one child in the world that has survived a post 5-year relapse. I said, are you saying the prognosis is 0? He said, statistically, yes. I said, okay. I said, Roger, it was. Previous time, it was 5% chance of survival. And here we are again, and it's starting all over again. So we started with a monster chemotherapy. And to be honest with you, Michael, they gave her the chemotherapy the first time, and she came so close to dying, it's hard to fathom nowadays. But she was within seconds of a full respiratory shutdown. And they pushed us out of the room and brought the emergency folks in, and they brought her back to life. But she was almost dead. So then they changed the chemotherapy a little bit so that she could withstand it, and we continued to do chemotherapy. But over the next 4 months, I could see her going downhill. And the fact of the matter is, it wasn't the disease that was killing her. They would do tests, and it was in her liver, but nowhere else. Oh, by the way, the bone marrow had cleaned up. Her marrow was positive with neuroblastoma cells, but the marrow had cleaned up. So it was in her liver, but not moving, and it made no sense. But anyway, in that scenario, she was dying. And so finally we reached a point, and my industry had sent us to New York so she could go to a Broadway play. We went and saw Beauty and the Beast. And it was like everything they're doing is preparing her for you're about to die. And I saw this happening. And so finally he called and said, okay, we need to start, I think, 5th round of chemotherapy. And I said, Roger, we need to talk. And so we went up and met in the conference room. And I sat across from him. And for the first time ever, this man that had become a dear friend, I felt like I was about to have a conflict with. And I looked at him and I said, Dr. Vega, I'm not doing this anymore. I said, I am not going to do chemotherapy. And he looked at me funny. And I said, Roger, I'm not going to let the cure kill her. I said, I feel like God has painted us in a corner. And I said, and I don't understand. I said, but he's sovereign and he can do what he chooses to do. But I'm not going to let the cure kill her. So we said, that's it. And he looked at me and he said, David, he said, let me be your doctor, not your friend. I said, okay. He said, if you choose this, and I understand what you're doing. He said, but if you choose this, you need to know that you might have 4 months with her. I said, I know. I said, again, I'm not going to let the cure kill her. So we stopped. He said, all right, what we will do is we'll do CAT scans every 3 months. I said, okay. We got 4 months. 3 months later, we did CAT scans. The disease is still there, but it's not growing. It always would take off, and it would be in the bones and everywhere, but it was not. It was still in just the liver, by the way. So 6 months later, we got past the 4. She's doing good. She's looking good. We do CAT scans. it's still in her liver, but not growing. And I said, Roger, how's that happen? He said, I have no idea. He said, I simply cannot answer that. He said, I don't know. Okay. So we go home and we're enjoying her, knowing that it could come back, could take off. So you just love her. Anyway, so 9 months after we took her off of chemotherapy, we did another CAT scan. Roger Vega walks out and says, it's not there. And I went, Roger, no chemotherapy, 9 months, and it's not there. He said, that's it. I said, how do you explain that? He said, do you remember years ago when I said, you need to look above the clouds? I said, of course. He said, that's all I got. He said, God wants this child alive. We saw a miracle again. And Michael, as we sit right now, that young lady is 35 years old. Now she's only 4'7", and she's faced multiple issues. She's had additional surgeries. They've told her that she's relapsed again twice. She's had other malignancies that have been cut out. Her chances of getting cancer are multiplied times greater than you and I because of all the radiation and all the chemotherapy. You know what? She's alive. She's a beautiful young lady, and she's 35. And I am one thrilled, proud dad. That's the story.
That's awesome. But as I heard you talk, we talked about three different things: your childhood and struggles with parents, and finding identity in that, and how you treat other people. Uh, your being a youth pastor and all that, your divorces and marriage and all that, and technically there's four, but the three I'm talking about. And we also talked about charity and being a parent. So in those three different scenarios that you have been involved in, what would you say to people to a kid in a negative home situation, or a couple that's facing a divorce, or a parent that's facing a struggle with a child? What advice, particularly a young parent like yourself?
Yeah, those are different scenarios, I guess, in reverse order. You have a child that suddenly is dealing with a monster medical condition. There are differences. There are those that are onset, like cancer, and then there are those that are chronic. You've dealt with chronic medical issues, and I've known people that have, and it's hard for me to say sometimes which is worse. Watching your child go through monster chemotherapy, a bone marrow transplant. Michael, I wouldn't put your worst enemy through that. It is horrific. But you know what? The thing I learned through all of that is you get grace for the moment. And I mean, it's hard to define what that means, but it is grace. It is a clarity of understanding that God's in control and I'm not. And you learn how to trust him in a really simplistic way. And so that's where that is. How do you deal with divorce? Boy, that is, if it's as horrific as dealing with your child with cancer, there are probably ways that divorce is more difficult. When you didn't choose it, when it's not what you wanted, when you still love that person at that point in time, it is extremely difficult because you are intertwined with that person. And I'm always reminded of when I think it was the Pharisees who came up to Jesus and was saying that Moses said that we could write a contract of divorce to our wife. What do you say? I'm fully convinced, and we don't have Bible for this, but I am absolutely fully convinced that Jesus at that point in time and turned and looked at them like they had totally lost their minds. Because in my strongest held opinion, the best representation of what marriage is the unity, the oneness that is in the Trinity. And so he was essentially saying, you need to understand something. I am so fully wrapped up and intertwined with my Father and with the Holy Spirit that we are one, even though we are separate. And there's no way that you can pull us apart. We are intertwined with each other. So y'all don't get it, because this thing that is intertwined, that represents marriage, is beyond your comprehension. And you're saying you want to be able to just throw her aside because she burnt the toast, or you got mad at her. And back in that day, that's basically what you could do. And men were so in control, and that's wrong. But we have a culture today that kind of has the same approach. You know, marriage is first of all not respected, and divorce is almost promoted. And so it takes people with a depth of spiritual understanding and a depth of commitment to reestablish what God wanted when it came to understanding the wholeness, the completeness that was and are in the Trinity. And so, the separation is clear to me, but the oneness is also that wholeness. Jewish people have said forever, the Lord our God is one, is a totality of one. So that is a marriage that you can't break apart. So how do you handle that? It is no different than dealing with destiny in my world, going through that. And I could keep you for hours talking about the pieces of that. But it was very similar as far as the depth of pain. And it was very similar to a death. And there's nothing you do about it. The if you take the marriage and put it over here, and it's its own entity, you're watching it die, and extremely difficult. And those that have gone through it, and I have done a decent amount of counseling for people that are going through it or have gone through it, and none of those am I able to look at somebody and say, "Oh, it's fine. You'll be fine." I normally say, "You need to understand this is not easy, and for a while it's not going to get easier." But as was true with destiny, there's grace in the moment, and so you wake up every day and you feel like that your life has left you, and there's grace in the moment. And what you find is that you grow closer to God during that time. If you allow yourself, if you don't go into bitterness, and I've seen that happen, you don't go into anger with God, or you want to go do something horrible to your spouse or your ex-spouse or whatever, as you let go of all of that and say, "God, I don't understand this, but I trust you." And this is identity, is understanding I am a child of God. I am in understanding I am somebody that he holds and values. And it makes no difference in the file analysis. It makes no difference what that person believes, what they've said, what they've done. And so my final marriage, understanding, and this is weird for some Christian people to understand, especially guys, men, but you and I are the bride, and we're married to the groom, and that will never be broken. There's no such thing as a divorce in that. So that representation is real. And so the groom is the totality of the Trinity and the fullness of the Holy Spirit inside of us, and it can't be broken. So that's the answer there. And it's hard to, but the men that I have sat down with, and some women who've gone through divorce, that sense of brokenness and rejection can live with them for years and years. And so they have to go deeper in that. My value is not based on what an ex-spouse has done or said, but my value and my identity is in who he made me to be. And I'm going to go make the best of every single day and every single moment that I have left, because my goal is not to get reunited with him or her. My goal is to know that I'm going home someday. That's however that makes sense. I hope that makes sense. And I guess the third one had to do with, remind me again.
Someone dealing with a bad home life.
Yeah, boy, that one's also difficult. You've got different versions of that. You've got nowadays in the culture, probably the hardest one of those for people to deal with. It's out there a lot. We have so many broken homes, and most of the time it's a single mom, and so you know, oftentimes she, with good conscience, is desperately trying to put a home life together that is right for her child or children. Um, and so I think you have to give that mother, as you're growing older as a child, you have to give that mother grace, because that's incredibly difficult. On the other hand, another version of that is kind of what I dealt with, where that you have the best way I know how to say that is you have a parent, especially a father, who doesn't have the father gene, and I don't, and that's a weird way of saying it, I guess, but doesn't know how to be it. And there's a difference between, I'm gonna say this candidly, but there's a difference between a sperm donor and a dad. And a dad is somebody that listens to your heart. And probably the best I've ever heard, and this is a father, what's a father? And you and I remember, and you're going to help me with her name because I'm forgetting right now, but what was the incredible lady who is a missionary in Africa that went to Bethel?
I know the face. I know the face.
Anyway, so,
But
but I'll tell you what she wrote. I've got her book sitting somewhere right over here. But among her, when she would speak, one of the things that impacted me so much is she said, every morning, she said, I wake up and I go climb into my father's lap. And she said, and I am so welcome there. She said, and I lay my head against his chest and I listen to his heartbeat. And every single one of his heartbeats is talking about how much he loves me and how much he loves everybody in this world. She said, and then I get clarity on what my purpose is. My purpose is to, first of all, know he loves me. And number two, to go love those people. So if you don't have a father who has any clarity of what being a father is, you go climb in the lap of he who does, and you learn that he is the real father. And so I didn't have a father who understood how to be a real dad. And I've forgiven him for that. I have. And he's on to be with the Lord now, and I know everything will be right when we get there. But for those that are dealing with that today, and there was areas in my own life as a father where I stunk. I mean, I traveled too much, and when the relationship with my kid's mother and I was not good, there were times when I probably found excuses not to be at home, and that's wrong. You somehow have to overcome that. But even so, you also don't beat yourself up. Sometimes in the moment you did as well as you could as a father. And the truth is, as a child, if you've got a father that doesn't get it today, you say, okay, God, I put him in your hands, but I'm going to stay connected to you. And that's what I would say to people that don't have a great home life is know who your real father is and pray that he will impact your earthly father.
so one last question, and then we'll pray, and then we'll end this. What would you like Jesus to say to you when you first meet him, when you finally leave this mortal coil?
Obviously we know, well done.
Good and faithful.
Yes, and
Yeah.
good and faithful. I mean, that's got to be the one. But there's a part of that where I think the words, you made it. It's like you understand that there's a longing in the heart of every man to go home. Except it was in a great movie one time, except it's to a home that I've never experienced. So that's back to that not having that home life that you long for. So, but that home is home. And that home is, I heard a girl who told the story of her dying and going to heaven, and I believe it's true. And she said, I saw heaven and I saw incredible colors and I saw the 24 elders, but heaven is Jesus. And so knowing that you walk in and you get to get his embrace, in spite of your own weaknesses when you were here, in spite of your own areas of your life that were imperfection and even sinful. And he says, nah, none of that makes a difference. No, that's over with. As far as the east is from the west, that's over with. And he embraces us. And so I think I look forward to the warmth of those eyes and him saying, my friend, my son, my brother, you're home. And I'm not rushing for that, but I love what one minister said, which was, I know that God has a purpose for me today, but if he were to whisper in my ear that today's your day, y'all better get out of my way. I'll knock you down. And I think that's accurate. Not that I would harm somebody, but you know what? If it's time to go home, let's go. And there should be no fear of death. I'm going home. And I think that's the peace that we should all live in. And so we live here at a place of radical transformation. And it's not, I'm something special, but it is that he's continuing to turn me into something. But I'm also knowing that there's a longing in the depths of me, that someday it is going to be all good because we're going to find that place where we are warmly embraced and we're going to be home.
So thank you, everyone, for being a part. David, would you pray for us, you and I, and then the viewers that happen to listen and watch this?
Lord and Father, and he who we love and adore, our friend and our brother and our Father, you are everything to us. Lord, I thank you for Michael, who has such a beautiful heart for you and a passion. I've known this young man, and I'm so thankful and proud of who he is becoming. And I thank you for this time that he and I have had together, and just to speak openly and honestly about what you're doing and what you have done. And we're forever thankful that you give us insights. We know that we see through the glass darkly. We don't fully see it all, but we know that we have within our own hearts this of an understanding. But more than that, today, as we live here today, we have the opportunity to carry the light that impacts people. And so the goal of our life is to enter every single day knowing that today is the only life I have. I wake up in the morning and I have this day. And Lord, I want you to give us each one of those days with an intentionality of within his will and within the opportunity that's there, we want to impact at least one person. And I'm fully believing that that doesn't mean that we witness. And I love the quote, witness to everybody you meet. And if absolutely necessary, use words, but bring something that is joy to the hearts of people, and especially those that are the hurting and the left out, the widows and the orphans. And we bring that to them, but we understand that the hurting sometimes can be millionaires and billionaires. So we love everybody, and we try to find a way to connect with people at this level that is inspired through the love of the Holy Spirit. So Lord, I'm asking you, give us depth, give us wisdom, and let us know that there's a deeper place that you want us to walk in so that we can impact the people around us. And then someday we can come home and we can fall into his arms, the Father, the brother, the friend that loves us so much. So again, thank you for this time with Michael, and thank you for the opportunity to just tell the stories where you have impacted my life. All of this, we thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.
To my viewers, thank you. To David, thank you for taking, because it's late there. It's really late. And thank you for taking your time with us tonight.
So good to see you, Michael. Hope we can catch up sometime.